It lets you use AI in basically every nook and cranny of your day-to-day. With that model came out, it actually opened up a lot of things that you could do. We use a lot of different providers, and that's because what we've seen with our internal evals is that they're all so nuanced and different in like a variety of different ways, but you also start to see where they lack. You'll get to an AI product, you get it to 90%, even 95%, but that last 5-10% is nearly impossible.
How do you think about model distillation?
It's very powerful, but you have to be very careful.
Had an amazing conversation with Sully Omar, the CEO of Cognisys, the company behind Auto.ai. Not only is he one of the best LLM practitioners that I've met, but you can tell he has a really deep feeling for how these models are actually working. He speaks from experience. In this interview, we go through his 3-tier system of actually ranking language models. He shows us how he uses meta prompts to develop his real prompts that he uses in production. He also shows us his cursor development flow, where he actually has the language model write the test first and then write the actual code. And finally, he walks us through distilling performance from large language models to small language models without losing performance. Let's jump into it and let's see what wisdom our friend Sully has to share. The reason why we're doing this interview here is because I see all of the cool stuff you're sharing on Twitter, and I'm like, this guy clearly has not only like a checklist learned ability to manipulate these models, but I can tell you feel them. Like you really feel how these things are actually going and the personalities and the nuances. And so I want to dig into that today.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I think it just comes from playing with these things every day, day in, day out, and using them and pushing them to their limit. And like, as cliche as it is, it's just like, sometimes you got to use them to vibe with them, you know,
Yeah.
right. So.
Yeah. It's so true. Well, I tell you what, I want to start off with one framework that I saw you document recently, which was your 3-tier model of language models. So tier 1 through tier 3. So could you tell me, like, starting at tier 3, what are those and how do you work your way up?
Yeah, so it's a framework that I mean, I don't even know if you want to call it a framework, but I like to categorize it into like based on intelligence and price, which is correlated, right? Like the less intelligent models are going to be your tier 3 models, and then your more expensive, slower are going to be your more intelligent models. So the reason I thought of it in 3 tiers was because of the application purposes. So the way that you use something like, let's say, O1, so that would be like a tier 1, is different than the way they would use something like Gemini Flash, which is tier 3. And that's because they all provide different purposes. One is super cheap, super fast. The other one's like really smart and really slow. So I broke it down to those 3 tiers. And the 3rd tier is basically what I like to call just like the workhorse, the ones that you're just constantly using 24/7. And within that category, I think there was 3 main models, but it's kind of come down to 2 for me personally.
Mhm.
So the first one is the one that I think people are probably more familiar with, which is GPT-4o Mini. Now, that model and is actually like I really, really like it because it lets you use AI in a way that previously you couldn't. Like if you were to go back, let's say 6 months ago when we had no cheap models, you had, let's say, GPT-4 and maybe even Claude 3.5. There was a lot of scenarios where you couldn't just be like throwing that at like random problems. Like you couldn't just be like, hey, I have this, 20-page document. I want you to go paragraph by paragraph and like extract the details, because realistically, like, you're going to be paying a lot of money. So with that model came out, it actually opened up a lot of like things that you could do. So that was the first one, which was GPT-4 Mini. And then the other one that I'm starting to really like is Flash. So Gemini Flash is actually half the price of GPT-4o Mini. And those are the tier 3 because, like I said, they give you a lot of optionality in the different things that you could do that you couldn't do before. It lets you use AI in basically every nook and cranny of your day-to-day, right? Whether it's your coding and you wanted to look at like 50 different files to summarize to help another model, for example. If you wanted to take a podcast and look at when did someone say a specific word in that podcast, right?
Sure.
You're not going to go to a bigger model. So that's what I call the tier 3. And then
Cool.
the second tier that I have is sort of like the middle. Obviously it's the middle tier, and this is where I like to slot in the actual GPT-4, Claude 3.5, Gemini Pro. This is where I think the majority of people use these models and kind of get the maximum usage out of them.
Mhm.
And then the last tier is obviously like the O1 preview, and then what I like to classify as thinking models.
Yeah, that's so cool. So I want to dig in more into the use case side. So which use case tasks are you doing tier two with? And then I know that O1 and tier one is going to be, it's not just, oh, I need it smarter. It's almost like a different type of task you're going to ask it to do. So how do you differentiate between those two?
Right. So the way that I like to differentiate is I I pair them. So I will use O1, and I use this in my day to day. It's like I'll go to ChatGPT,
Mhm.
and if you just go and say, "Hey, like to O1, can you do this task for me?" One, it's going to take a little bit of time. You're probably going to hit some rate limits because it's highly limited, and realistically, you're not going to use the model the way that I think it was intended somewhat to be used. So if you say like, "Hey, how's it going?" Like, okay, sure, you could use it like that, but realistically, you're better off using, the tier two. So how I use the tier two is actually the
Mhm.
most. I use it the most. Obviously, everyone uses it for coding, whether it's Claude 3.5, GPT-4. Using it for like function calling or tool calling, like it is obviously like a good balance between intelligence and price.
Mhm.
And that's kind of like what I use it the most, whether I'm writing, whether I'm asking it to like, hey, help me edit an email or things like that. I'm using those like middle tier ones. Now, how I actually use that in tandem with O1 is I'll sort of, one of the use cases I have is I'll come to ChatGPT or Claude, and I'll sit there and I'll just create a giant conversation about a
Mhm.
specific topic. So let's say, for example, I'm deep diving into a research topic and I want to learn more about. Now, I'm not going to actually go straight into O1 because I feel like one, it's a bit slow. What I'll do is I'll start the topic with GPT-4 or Claude, and I'll like add files because obviously I think right now O1 doesn't support like files and web search. So there's a lot of capabilities that O1 doesn't support. And what I
Mhm.
like to call is the context building. So I will just go and build as much context in this chat as I possibly can, or it could be in any platform. And I'll sit there and iterate. I'll actually use voice mode as well to sort
Hmm.
of give context because it's a lot quicker, and that's another workflow. And as soon
Sure.
as I have like let's say like 2 to 3 pages worth of documents, I'll actually take that and paste it into a chat with O1 or O1 preview. And I'll say, hey, do this gigantic task for me. So for example, I'll give you one thing,
Uh-huh.
things I use it for is like, I was using it to generate use cases for my product. And I was like, okay, I want to generate use cases and I want to understand, what are some potential customer segments and ICPs. It's just like a pretty technical question. And if I were to just go to O1 and ask it that, it would have no context. It doesn't know what my product is. It has no clue what my product does, who my customers are. And if I were to sit there
Mhm.
and chat with it, well, I'm going to hit that limit. But if I go to Claude or ChatGPT, I can upload documents. I can create this basically a PDF and copy paste it into O1. And then I can say, generate me, personas, ICPs. It does a lot better. So that's sort of the workflow and use case that I have currently running with like the tier two and the tier one models.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. One of the ways that I found O1 works for me really well is around actually deduplication. So if I have a long list of items that say I've processed 5 different chunks with the same type of workflow for each chunk, well, I'm going to have a list of duplicated items. I give that whole thing to O1. It's actually really good at deduplicating. And then I'll use one of the tier two models to do the structured output after that, since O1 doesn't yet support structured output, and go from there.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's another thing I do as well is I'll take O1 and give me like a long verbose output and then take that and turn it into structured data sets
Yeah.
with the tier two. And even sometimes you could even get away with using that with the tier three because
Mm.
you don't even need to worry about the output. You're just like, hey, I want this nicely formatted in whatever shape.
Yeah, 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 for sure. So it sounds like you're using different models across different providers too, for different use cases, or do you stick with one all the time?
Yeah, so we use a lot of different providers, and that's because what we've seen with our internal evals is that they're all so nuanced and different in like a variety of different ways. So obviously the big one, Gemini multimodal right off the bat, like anything to do with videos or audios, I'll go, dive in straight into that and kind of use Gemini. But you also start to see where they lack. So for example, a really interesting one is Gemini models are really good at needle in the haystack. And so
Mm,
if you say, hey, I want you to find one or two pieces of information in this, giant long piece of text or video, it's actually really good. But then
nice.
I started to notice that something like GPT-4o Mini is a little bit better reasoning over that. So if I give it a long piece of context and I say, hey, I want you to sort of understand the context of it, I found that GPT-4o Mini is a little bit better. So you start to see where one model does better than the other model in specific areas. So like another example is Claude 3.5 and GPT-4o. Now, Claude is obviously, everyone loves that model. It's a really good model. But one thing it's absolutely horrible at is tool use with structured
Mm.
outputs. And you'll
Hmm.
start to see this if you the very complex tool, like I want you to create the very deep, like a nested JSON, a very, long structured output, like a very large amount of the time it fails and it gives you XML and it just breaks all your parsers. Whereas
Sure.
GPT-4o Mini does a lot better job. But then the caveat is that GPT-4o Mini is not as good at actually like thinking through the problem and acting as an assistant. So there's always these like tiny trade-offs that you don't
Yeah.
really like notice. One of the things that we did was we set up a like one of the use case was to get around that was we set up Claude and GPT-4o Mini to work together, where the tool use for Claude would be to call GPT-4o Mini, and
Mm.
we basically created a system where Claude could orchestrate GPT-4o Mini to create the structured output. So it would say, "Please do this." So the user would say, "I want this task." All Claude would do was relay that information to GPT-4o Mini. 4o
Mm.
Mini creates a structured output, and then that gets returned. So that was like another use case of like how we mix and match so many models across different use cases.
Yeah, isn't it wild how all these little mini vibe tricks we have to kind of like hack together in the early days of LLMs here? And then I think back to how far we've already come. Like, because even like, like January of 23, we're dealing with like 4,000 token context limits and GPT 3.5. And all the hacks that we had then, we've upgraded from them now, but we still have a bunch of hacks like the ones you're talking about. And so it just makes me think we're never going to get rid of the hacks and they're always going to be there for a long time.
I would say so too, because yeah, like you're right. It's funny looking back at it. The hacks that you used in 2023 were so different. You were hacking around context window, and
Yeah.
now you're hacking around tool use, which didn't even exist a year ago, right? Or like a year and a half ago. So I agree with you that we're always going to be min maxing as a user of multiple models. You're going to be min maxing, trying to figure out for your use case, for your product, for your company, where can I, mash these together so that I get the best possible outcome for my users. And
Yeah.
I know a lot of people have, and I'm curious what you think. A lot of people have spoken about like model routers and how,
Mhm.
at the end of the day, like a model is just going to pick it. But my personal opinion is I think that it's going to cause a lot of unintended side effects. But I'm curious what you think on like this whole
Sure.
idea of like model routing, because we're
Yeah.
talking what we're basically doing. We're internally with code model routing, but I'm curious what you think.
So whenever I get asked a question like this, I think, is there any behavior in practice that tells me what the prediction should be? And you just described basically you're doing model routing on your own, like in and of itself. So that tells me, yes, model routing will be a thing. And I do still think that fine tuning models and having bespoke small models is still too much overhead. Like it's really hard to do that and manage them and do them all right now. All that is going to get so much easier. So I would imagine that not only will we have model routing for task specific things against like some of the big ones where you have vibe based feels with regards to structured output or tool use or whatever it may be, but then also for task specific things, I will absolutely do model routing. So I'm a fan. I think it's hard. I think it will be the future. We're not quite there yet, though. That's for sure.
Got you. Yeah, like my sentiment there was that it could be just because the model's just where we're at right now. What I've noticed is, and I'm sure you've seen the same, is where you'll get to an AI product, you get it to 90%, even 95%, but that last 5% is last 10% is nearly impossible. I find like it even you can run all the evals you want, you can run all the benchmarks, getting that last 10%. And my thought process there is that if you have the model sort of choosing other models, that
Mhm.
adds to the variance, so it
Yeah.
causes a lot more potential, like that's kind of where my thinking is. And that could just be because like we're early, like realistically we're so early, models have multiple generations to get better. So that was my thought, was that maybe in the future, but right now probably not, because it's
Yeah.
so hard to get a product in, specifically like LLMs, into production where you're handling every potential edge case in a manner that gives you as high of an accuracy as you can, and adding
Totally.
models that you might not have an eval for could give you an output that you didn't expect.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Well, I tell you what, one of the other interesting things that came up during research was your opinion on what is kind of becoming known as model distillation. So you have a really, really good model, you perfect the output from there, but then you realize, wow, I can actually come up with a little bit of a better prompt here and give it to a smaller model so that you have it's faster and it's cheaper. So can you talk me or walk me through how do you think about model distillation in your own workflow?
Yeah, so that's something I think about a lot, and it's one of those things where you need to be very careful because it's very powerful, but you have
Mhm.
to be very careful because it requires a lot of work. And the reason it needs a lot of work is because you need to have a good data pipeline and understand what you're distilling. So one of the things and mistakes I made previously with the product was that we had GPT-4o. And this was actually before GPT-4o. It was GPT-4 Turbo, and we used it and it was slow. And we're like, hey, let's distill that to 3.5. OpenAI has a really nice um, way to do it, so we did that. And the problem was that we didn't have good enough evals. We didn't have a good enough data set. So as the potential, the various areas grew that people could use the product, we would notice, okay, we have to revert back to GPT-4 because 3.5 was at that time not good enough. Now, where I do see distillation in our workflow is when you have a
Mhm.
defined eval set, you have like all your benchmarks, and you have a very good data pipeline where you can say, okay, in this 500 example set, I'm using Claude 3.5 Sonnet or your, O1, for example. I have my data set, and you can use a bunch of different, there's a lot of different companies that provide you with like ways to manage your and prompts and evals, whether it's Braintrust or Langsmith. And then
Mhm.
you can very accurately detect and determine the accuracy of the distilled model. Then 10 out of 10 times I would use it.
Nice.
And it's actually really easy. Like to actually distill the model down, it's like it's a single API call. The
Uh-huh.
challenging part is making sure that you don't regress your product when you
Sure.
do the distillation. But I think it's one of those things that it's going to become more and more apparent as the tooling around distillation becomes like better. I know there's a couple companies working on it, like OpenPipe is one of them,
Yeah.
and I know OpenAI straight up offers you that. So I think as the tooling gets better, you're going to see this pattern in production of companies launching with the biggest, best model. They collect a bunch
Mhm.
of data. They have a good eval set and engineering team to support that. Then they go and they distill it to whether GPT-4o Mini or an open source model.
Yeah, that's beautiful. My favorite line with that is the whole make it work, make it right, make it fast. And so it's like, look, you're going to use the biggest one to start us off, but then you're going to make it fast eventually and go from there. Um, this is awesome. I tell you what, though. So I know you're a practical person. I would love to jump into like you actually showing us some of the ways that you use these tools. And I think a really cool starting off point would be I know that you're a fan of prompt optimizers or like meta prompt writing. And so
Yes.
because you had a tweet and literally said, pretty good chance you won't be prompting from scratch in 2 to 3 months. So I would love to see the way you kind of prompt engineer your way from like an idea to like, I'm going to go use this thing.
Okay, yeah. Hopefully my prediction ages well because I feel like it's been a month since I said that, and I don't know if we're 2 to 3 months away from it. But
Yeah, yeah,
um,
yeah, yeah.
okay, let me. Yeah, just to add some context, I do a lot of this sort of meta prompting where I'll come in
So
with a
yeah,
problem.
what is meta prompting? Let's start there.
You come in with a general idea of what you're trying to do. You have a problem that you're trying to solve. Like realistically, if you're coming in, you don't know what problem you have that you're trying to solve with AI. It's sort of useless. So an example would be the other day I was trying to get one of the models to write like me, which to this
Mhm.
day
Yeah,
I cannot for whatever
yeah,
reason.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I was like, I came into it and I came into ChatGPT and I had all my examples and I was like, okay, what do I write? And I would write something like, you write like a basic prompt structure, and the reality is that prompt's probably not that good. So what meta prompting, or what I like to think about this idea is that you come in with an idea, hey, I want to have an AI write like me. I have examples, and then I just give that to O1 or Claude, and I say, please create the prompt for me. And that's sort of what I like to think of like this. I come in with a rough idea of what I'm trying to do. I don't really know specifically how to optimize it. I'll go to these models and say, hey, like actually give me this prompt structure. And it does a pretty good job. So that's kind of the rough idea of how it works. But
That's
should we just hop into like
Yeah, I would love to jump into it if you could share your screen. And then are you using just a regular chat interface or are you going to Anthropic's Workbench and doing their prompt optimizer?
I just use the chat interface because
Cool.
I feel like the prompt. I mean, some people do use it. I think you can start with it, but I
Mhm.
just find it easier because I can iterate a lot better. I
Nice.
can say, "Hey, start like this," and do that. So let's actually do it. But I want to
Yeah.
start and say, do you have some sort of task that like we should start with like a rough idea because I like. Do you have any like what's the task we could demo?
Let's do a straightforward one. Let's do what I guess I'll give you a few options. You tell me what you think is best. We could do the classification one, which is very standard. Hey, I have some data sources, or can you please label them for me? Um, we could do either like unstructured to structured extraction, so like extracting insights from a piece of text, or we could do idea generation. That's always a fun one too.
Okay, let's do the extracting text one, and I think that's a good one. So let's say I like to always preface it with like the problem or what we're trying to do. So again, what I like to come into it is like, all right, I have a problem. I'm trying to do a specific task, and usually this is like my blank slate starting point. So let's say the task that I'm trying to do is I have a large piece of text, and I want to turn that piece of text into something else, some sort of structured output, and
Hmm.
it's funny because a lot of people say like, "Oh, is it complicated?" It's really like I just come to ChatGPT and or Claude and I basically say that. So the way that I go is I'll say, you could use Claude or ChatGPT. I haven't found which one is really better. Again, and this is kind of going back to my original workflow.
Sure.
Is what I'll do is I'll actually start with GPT-4 or Claude, and I'll get like a rough idea for a prompt, and I'll copy that and I'll give it to O1, and then I'll start to compare across all three to see which one like makes the most sense. So let's say, for example, in this one, I am grabbing transcripts from podcasts, and I want to know like I want a nice like structured output for
Hmm.
all of the key exciting moments. Let's say that's like the problem space. So now you
Sure.
could come in and you could create a prompt and says, okay, given this video, I want you to do this. Or I come to Claude and say, look, like, and actually the other workflow that I wish I could demo is I use voice a lot. So I don't know if you use voice a lot, but I've noticed that with
You know,
voice here.
I don't use it a ton. Yeah, it hasn't entered my workflow yet, but I'm voice curious, so I want to try
Let's
it out.
actually see this. Let's see this. Okay, so I have something here. I want to show you the whole workflow that I use so that
Nice.
let's see here.
And let me know if you need a transcript. I have one handy for us.
Actually, yeah, could you toss me it there,
Yeah.
and then I will use it. I'll copy paste this. So, okay, let me know when you have that transcript, and then love these guys.
MFM,
Okay,
small plug. This is MFM Vault, a website I put together that does insight extraction from My First Million. There we go.
okay, cool. So let's say our goal is to extract insights. Now, my workflow is I have a tool that transcribes this, so I think it works. So let's say I'll just exactly show you how to do it. Okay. Hey, I need a bit of help creating a prompt for a use case. So what we're doing right now is taking podcast transcripts and trying to extract all of the key moments / key insights. So I need you to create a nice prompt that will, help us do that. And I'm going to put in the prompt as well later on the actual transcript, but I need you to create the prompt / system prompt. So boom. So that's actually sort of how I do it. There's
Nice.
no real science to it, and I'll sit
Sure.
there and I kind of like here, and I'll copy this, and I'll actually do this. So I'll go into ChatGPT, I'll paste it, and I'll actually also place it into Claude, and it's gonna go and it's gonna give me like a starting point. And so right off the bat, like if you're maybe not as good at prompting or you're new to prompting, like you can read this. Like obviously, if you're more experienced and you kind of know like what you're doing, these kind of prompts are like pretty obvious. But for a lot of people, they'll come in and be like, okay, cool, I have a good starting point. So then what I'll do is
Sure.
I'll look at this and say, okay, the following is a podcast transcript, identify key system, and I'll compare it to here. So right off the bat, I don't know which one you think is better, but I'm looking at this and I like the Claude output better.
Cool. Beautiful.
Just a little bit more, what's it called? Clear direction. So I'll actually copy this and I'll be like, okay, we have a rough outline. I liked the first pass. I liked the one from Claude. I'll take that and I'll go back to ChatGPT and I'll open up a new tab and then I'll say, let's go to O1 preview. So then I'll actually do the same thing. I'll say, and I'll actually give it more context. So I'll say something along the lines of, and again, I'll go back to the voice mode here. I'll say, hey, you're going to help me optimize a prompt. So I already got another AI model to give me a rough idea for this prompt. I want you to look at it and tell me if there's any areas in the prompt that we could improve. So I'll give you the prompt, and I'll actually give you the prompt that I gave to the AI that generated this prompt. So it's going to go, and then I'm going to go like this. So this is sort of here, original prompt to AI. I'll paste that in a sec.
What's amazing is just how you speak to it just like a human. Like, it's not complicated. It's literally just being clear in your directions.
It's something that I recently started to do, and I think it's a lot of people talk to the AI as if it's not a human, but they perform the best when you just speak to it naturally. And I found that voice is the best modality to do that in, because it's very hard to sound robotic when you're talking to like the chat. It's like you have to just talk naturally. And then I found that it's also a lot faster. Like if I were to sit here and type that, it would take me a lot. So here, I'll go here, I'll paste this original prompt, and then I'll say, okay, cool. So I like that one. And now this is the second pass. And now this is where, again, kind of going back to the workflow that I use, right, is I'll come in here and iterate with voice on this specific subset of a problem, which is generating this kind of like mega prompt. We sat there with GPT-4o, we sat there with Claude, iterated a bit. And then I'm like, okay, I have a rough idea. This prompt looks somewhat good. And then I'll come back to O1 preview and I'll say, okay, cool. I want you to optimize this. And I haven't found, I don't have a real scientific method to which one is best, because I just kind of sit there and this is kind of where I have like a good first generation of the prompt. Realistically, I'll put this into production. I'll write a couple of evals. I'll say, okay, how does this actually perform? And then kind of iterate back. But this is sort of my starting point. So we'll let this go. Okay, so here, and then it gives me some things. Can you please generate the new prompt now? All right, cool. It gives me the revised prompt.
Cool. So it did thinking out loud, and then it gives you finally the answer.
Yeah, and sort of you can see here, and you can obviously see here, this is just for the sake of this. And now what I'll do is I will take this, and then I will actually go to, and this is my full workflow. We can use any model, but let's say we're going to use, you have a preference of which model you want to test out the actual transcription? We can actually
I'd love to hear which one you think and why, and let's just test it out.
Let's test it out. So now we go to Studio. So, and you see what I mean? It's like, there's all these different models. I'll go to Studio, which is Gemini. Now we're going to go to Gemini, which I found, so specifically Gemini Pro, better at sorts of these sort of tasks. And now I'm here with Gemini Pro, which I'm going to take and grab the prompt that I crafted with O1, put it into the system prompt of what's it called, Gemini Pro, paste in the transcript, and let's see how it goes.
All right, beautiful. Yeah, that sounds great.
All right, let's copy this here. Okay.
This is how the sausage is made.
Yeah, this is how I like to think of like the first generation of a prompt, where I'm not really sure where I'm starting off with. Obviously, is this something that I would use in production? Probably not, because you want to test it out and have a lot of back and forth. But okay, cool. Is there a way to copy paste the transcript?
You're just going to have to select all down at the bottom there. That would be nice to just copy the transcript. Actually, I think I might add that feature in there.
Yeah, it's let me see if I can just copy this. So I'm on. All right. Cool. Now we go grab this. Okay, and then I'll obviously do a second pass to make sure that this actually makes sense. Key moments, because obviously, okay, this looks pretty good. Timestamp, 3 dynamic takeaways, extract 1 sentence, discussion themes, theme name. Okay, cool. So here I'll paste this in and we'll let it run here. So I'm using Gemini Pro. All right, 17,000 tokens. And for people who are curious, Gemini Pro, I talked about this recently, is that a lot of models can't actually reason over large context. But for something like Gemini Pro, anything under 100K tokens, it's pretty good at being able to synthesize a relatively intelligent answer. So here,
Yeah,
Okay,
that's cool.
cool.
That's really cool.
And how, yeah, key moments, how you leverage CrossFit. I'm actually curious to like see how it just would do against like other benchmarks because we don't really know if this is a good output or not, and that's where the
Sure.
whole point of evals is. But there you go. You have how I went from an idea to generating like a full, I guess, air quote here, optimized
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
prompt. And the reason for that is just like for me to sit here and write this probably would have taken like an hour, hour and a half, maybe like give or
Yeah.
take, depending on how good you are. But we just did it live in whatever 10 minutes. So
Yeah, that's super, super cool. I love that. Um, so then out of curiosity, what are you using for prompt management? So I saw a tweet by the CEO of PromptLayer, Jared, and he's like, "Yeah, I see everybody. They go through the same world. First, their prompts are just hard coded in their code, and then second, their prompts are hard coded in text files, but they're still in their code base. And then third, you actually go to a prompt manager. What are you using for prompt management?
so for that's like interesting one. We use GitHub for our prompts.
Yeah,
So we use a couple of different things. And maybe maybe we're not prompt managing correctly, but
uh,
we just have our prompts that we store in Langsmith
mhm.
and sort of I'll just have data sets and I'll compare that prompt to that data set. So for example, we have a giant data set of like 1,000 examples that I run our test against different models, different prompts. And that prompt is just like stored, in the data set. And then whenever I want to change the prompt, I'll actually change
Mhm.
it and duplicate the data set, paste in the
Mm,
new prompt, and that's like
mhm,
my version control, so to speak. So the
mhm.
actual prompt stays in my code base with the latest version of like this is the source of truth, and
Mhm.
all previous other versions are different data sets where I can see how they perform. So for example, if I want to go back to a prompt that was like, let's say from a week ago, I just look at the data set that was from a week ago and I can see the prompt is there, and then I can also see how it performed. So that's how I manage like and version
Interesting.
it. I'm not sure if it's the right approach, but that's how I do it.
Sure. So in your code, is the prompt that's being called, is it actually in your code, or are you calling out
Yeah,
to LangHub and Langsmith every single time?
it's in the code. So
Okay. Yeah.
our code, it's in GitHub, and the nice part is because it's just all version controlled. Like I
Yeah.
could look at the Git history and I can actually see, okay, this person changed this line as well, which is nice. So I have the line by line version control from Git, and then if
Sure.
I want to see the full prompt, I can look back at like the data management tool.
Yeah, that's very cool. I tell you what, I had one more demo on here that I was like, this would be so cool if Sully would show us how we use this. It's a cursor one actually. So I saw that you tweet, you said, so I actually have the LLM write the test first, then the code. It helps a ton, which that's a framework I don't see too many people doing. Of course, there's test-driven development, but like not in practice, not usually. I'm not seeing a lot of people do that. Could you walk us through like how do you write that test first and then how do you ask it to write code right after that?
Yeah, okay. This is one that the reason I started to do was because the problem I was facing, the model just kept messing up. Like every
Sure,
single time it was within our code base, and I was like, this is a waste of my time. The model
sure.
can't figure it out. How about I just get it to generate the test first? And
Uh-huh.
then if the test works, then it can maybe look at the code and say where the issues are because models, guess what? If a test fails, you can grab the error output, give it back to the model and say, "Hey,
Mhm.
like please decipher that." So let's actually see if I can spin up
Like a little mini project or something, or
yeah, let's see here if I can spin up something new.
I actually think this is really cool. And this is like something like really truly not enough people are doing this. And if it legit helps you write better code, because it makes sense. You have the test that's supposed to run successfully, and it can use that as instructions, and it can use that to like test to make sure it's actually working.
I'm surprised not more people are doing this where it's like right that's like it's just a lot easier for the LLM to like do that and then your code is say I guess like less spaghetti because you're not worried about if something changes like the model like you start with the tests and it's really easy for the model to generate it. Okay, so that took a little time. I got just a cursor here. So this is just a super quick. Let me just grab the screen here. Super quick here. So I have this super basic thing. We can just terminal. We can run it, and I can go fun index. That's yes. Hello world. Now, I actually like to start with cursor, and I'll just say something along the lines of like literally. And again, I actually don't know how to write tests in Bun, so I can just go to cursor. I open up Command I, and for those of you who don't, this is like the composer. It lets you coordinate and create files. So I'm going to say, I'm using Bun for now. Create a test file for a method, and then make the method that, let's say, for now, reverses a string. Super simple. And I guess I'm out of slow requests, unfortunately. Okay.
Wow.
So what it'll first do is it'll create the test, right? And this is obviously a really simple example. And so here, I'm happy with this. All right, I'll just accept this.
Sure.
And now, right off the bat, like there's, how many, whatever, 5 tests here. So obviously, I have the actual function. So here in this example, it's just reversing a string. Now, the nice part is I can go here. I can say, bun, I guess it's reverse test.ts. And I can, again, debug with Composer. This is the nice part. I can just go debug with AI. I gotta up my man. I'm out of the free. That's how much I use cursor. I just always blow through the budget. But okay, cool. So here it passes the test. But let's actually say that like we are using something a little bit more complicated than reversing a string. Now I can go into here and I can say, let's just not reverse it. Let's just say let's just break the code. Let's just say here we'll split it like this. Okay. Return dot. Okay. So now if I go here, I go test. If I go test file, so all these tests fail, right? Now, obviously, this is like a pretty simple example, and it's almost as simple as just clicking this button that says add to composer, and then I say, please fix the reverse method due to errors. And now the nice part is here, cursor will pull in that terminal that'll throw the errors where it happens, and what cursor will do is they'll look at that and they'll say, hey, look, I see what the issue is, and it'll just fix it. So this is kind of what I like to call of like, I don't actually have a name for it yet, maybe LLM test-driven development, whatever you want to call it. But it's like you come in and you describe what you're trying to do here. The LLM writes the tests for it, and then it's going to write the method. And then what you can do is have it run. And now if the method itself, like this function, which is reversing a string, is complex or confusing, it will be able to sort of like essentially agentically, air quote here, fix itself, if that makes sense. It'll test the code, see if it passes the tests. If not, it'll update the code and then sort of do that until it can, pass the test. And all you have to do is make sure that the tests you're writing are correct. And I use this a lot obviously for simple functions, it's not that useful. But when you have code that is across a couple different files, in a modern code base, it's not just a single function. It's like you have a bunch of different files and stuff connecting, and ones that require a lot of like conditionals or like they're not as simple as this. It's like that's where I found that whenever I would try to get like I'd get like Sonnet to one shot it would fail every single time. But then a second that I was like, okay, please let's write the tests for it, and then I would sit there and kind of help it write the test. It was able to debug itself a lot better and go through these like bigger, maybe meatier functions that normally wouldn't be able to, even like O1 and O1 mini couldn't solve. But the second that I would apply this like test driven development, whatever you want to call it, the model was able to look at the output, see where it messes up, adjust the code, and kind of iterate on itself like that.
That's cool. So not only does this test first mindset, it's kind of like a prompt engineering technique. It's almost like think out loud, but it's almost like write the goal first and then tell me what you think we should do for it. But you also get tests out the other end. And so you get a little bit of extra utility as a byproduct.
Exactly. It's a win-win. You get a little bit of both. And to me, that was the one thing I never understood why people haven't done more of, because you would think, well, if it passed all the tests, the code is like, you're happy that it passed the test, but it's something that I haven't seen a lot of people do.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that's awesome. Well, that's fabulous. Thank you for showing me the cursor example. One of the questions I love asking is, I want to know what the smart people are talking about right now, like in AI. So like, as you observe on Twitter in your circles, what are the smart people talking about?
Oh, that's a good question. Oh man, I think what I see a lot of people talking about is sort of the, what's it called? Like test time compute, like O1 thinking. I see a lot of people talking about those. I see a lot of people talking about having those thinking models do more agentic sorts of tasks, and basically bringing this, what I like to think of as an agent, as a for loop inside to the model thinking process, having and training the model to just innately be able to call tools like, and we saw that. I think a good example of that is computer use, right, from
Mhm.
Anthropic, right? They obviously fine tuned it on that. So I see a lot of people talking about that. I do see what I started to notice is people starting to talk about whether we've hit some variation of a wall. I don't know if you've seen it too,
Mm,
and I'm
for
hearing a
sure.
little rumors that Claude 3.5 Opus is not up to par, and like the new Gemini model is not as good. So I'm hearing that as well. And what else are people really talking about? And I think we spoke a lot about the other things, model distillation.
Sure.
And the other thing I've started to see more of is people being a little bit, not, I guess, talking more about evals. Like I think a lot of
Mm.
people didn't really talk about it, and people are saying, hey, like from a product perspective, if you want your product to be good, you need to write evals, which are just a way of writing tests. So that's kind of what I've been seeing, and I don't know if you've seen
Cool.
anything different, but just from what I've heard from people talking.
Yeah, let me think. Is there anything else I would add to that list? The one thing people aren't talking about it, but I think it will be a big deal when it actually comes out, is the whole feature engineering, weight manipulation, like the Golden Gate Claude Anthropic that they
Oh
came out with
yeah,
a while ago. I'm still waiting for access to that because that is going to be an alternative to prompt engineering, and I have no idea like how easy it's going to be to work with, what kind of results we're going to get. But I'm excited to test that whenever it comes out.
yeah. I remember seeing that, and I was blown away, and I kind of forgot about it. So that
Yeah,
I'm actually interested to see if they ever will ever let you have that much interoperability with those models. Like maybe they're
for
just like,
sure,
no, we're good. Sorry, we're shelving it. Like you're not allowed to touch it, right? But
for
that
sure,
would
for
be
sure.
really interesting.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Awesome. Two more questions here. Last one. I love hearing about what is in people's toolkit. So I've seen you use Excalidraw on your YouTube videos. I've seen you use Replit. I've heard rumblings about V0. What else is in your toolkit that is in your kind of day-to-day workflows?
Okay. Okay. So there's a lot, I guess. Yeah, you got a couple. V0. Obviously, there's Cursor. Excalidraw. I like it for drawing little diagrams. The other one, I guess, that I use a lot is the Playground from Anthropic and from OpenAI, which
Cool.
is like different than ChatGPT. I use that to iterate on prompts. I use this. Yeah, the one that I use for transcribing the actual audio is called WhisperFlow. It's the one where I have a hotkey that I press,
Mm.
and it takes the voice and transcribes it into the inputs that you saw me use. The other tooling that I use, I mean, we can go in. Do you want to go into the technical side, or are we just going to leave it at like the high level
I mean,
tools?
let's not go like I don't want to know your entire tech stack, but like what is in like the cool AI stuff that like you're grabbing for?
I think that's pretty much it. I think you got it there. There's not many other tools that I honestly use. I
Cool.
just I a lot of it's, yeah, like just writing the code. Langsmith is one, actually. I will say
Okay.
that we use Langsmith a lot for evals. That's like the other one. But yeah, that's pretty much it from me. I think you nailed it. V0, Cursor, Excalidraw, OBS if you're recording videos.
Yeah,
So
yeah, 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 for sure. All right, last question. And this is kind of off topic from the AI side, but I know people would be interested in it. So you've had a few bangers on Twitter, like just some things that just absolutely pop. And as somebody who does a little bit of Twitter himself too, I can look at a tweet and be like, that person thought about it and they did a really good job as to how they architected it and constructed it. And I noticed that with yourself. So what hits on Twitter and what's your advice for people who like want to do better on it?
oh man. Okay. So Twitter is just this hilarious platform that the algorithm changes a lot. So it's you kind of got to get a feel for what works and what doesn't. And luckily, the cost. So for anyone's looking to grow, the cost to post on X/Twitter is zero. Like you don't pay anything. If it doesn't do well, no one cares. So it's the one platform where the cost is literally zero because you're just typing. So type things away. How I craft a banger, it's like a mixture of what I see trending. So what I see, what people are talking about, and there's two ways to craft a banger. One is you have to be controversial. You are
Uh,
not going to craft a banger if you're not controversial. Now, there's pros and cons. If you're posting that kind of stuff all the time, people will be like, "Hey, you're just posting clickbait." So you got to be careful with it. You can't be like, "This is insane," and every single tweet starts with that. Like no one's going to believe you. But saying something controversial. And the most important part of crafting a banger is your hook. I can tell, like, honestly, I'll post something and I can tell within 20 minutes if it's going to be a banger or not. And it's basically how natural does it come? That's one. That's like, how natural did this thought come to me? And how well did I craft that hook? Everything in between, like, you can kind of sit there and min-max, but that's how I sit there. And sometimes I'll sit on something and I'll be like, oh man, like, I just don't know the right way to say it, so I won't post it. But then it'll just come to me and I'll be like, all right, I got this. All the words, I'm using the right structure. It's like the right timing. And that's kind of what goes into crafting it. So the one piece of advice that I will give from my personal experience is don't spend too much time on a tweet. Because unless you're doing educational, there should be a diagram where the more time you spend thinking about a tweet, the worse it does. Because I swear, the majority of my bangers, I spend like 15 minutes thinking about. And I'm like, all right, I'm just going to post it. Grab a coffee. I come back and it's blow it up.
And then all of a sudden you see 1.4 million views.
Right. Oh man, do you have time? I have to tell you the story of how the company started. Do I have time for that?
Yeah, let's hear it.
Okay, so because it's so relevant to the banger tweet. So my company, we started like a year and a half ago, and this is around the time that agents, like, people were talking about them but didn't have any clue. This was, let's say, March 2023. And at this time, no one actually knew of my account. I literally had been posting tweets and no one replied. The classic 0 views. That's just what happens. Yeah. And I remember I saw someone else post something about AutoGPT, and I saw it and I was like, that looks pretty cool, but I ignored it. And then it came up again, and I was like, no, I cannot not ignore this. Like, this seems something very interesting. And I'd been building actually like AI projects, side projects before this. And I was like, you know what? Let me like try this thing out. And obviously I tried it. And back then I was like, dude, this is insane. Agents, AI is going to be crazy. So when I was like, I just posted about it. And like, I didn't post anything crazy. And I was like, oh yeah, this thing is kind of cool. It's pretty crazy. And it like got like, I think that was the first post that got over 1,000 likes. And I was like, wait a minute.
Wow.
And then I was like, hold up a second. Then I saw this trend that people wanted to do something about like AI agents. And it's interestingly enough, I like thought back to an episode of MIF, like My First Million. Again, cool. So funny. And I remember them talking about like, there's sometimes you see like this opportunity. And I was like, dude, I got to sit here and I got to do 2 things. First, I got to craft something. I got to make a product that people want to use. And I got to figure out the right Twitter thread and narrative and story to craft to get people on it. So that weekend, I spent the whole weekend building V0 of Cognosis, which was like our previous product. In the meantime, posting Twitter bangers and threads about how AI agents were going to change everyone's life. And every single post was getting like 1 million views. I'm not even exaggerating.
Wow.
And I was like, dude, and I was like, okay. And all I would be posting, I was like, it was kind of clickbaity. I was like, this is going to change your life. And then getting like million views. And then I post the product. I was like, hey, like, here, I built this thing for you people to go and try. Cause I know from what you've been telling me, you don't want to go through GitHub. And I posted out, and it was literally built it in like 3 days. And within like 2 days, we got 50,000 users. So
oh my goodness, that is so crazy.
It was the craziest 2 weeks and the most stressful 2 weeks of my life. And it started all from how can I craft a banger tweet. So I will say that was why it's so relevant and so funny. Cool. It just shows how powerful writing well and writing with the right timing and structure, given what's happening, can potentially, help you start a company. So.
And with that is an absolutely beautiful story to end on. Sully, thank you very much for joining us today.
Oh, dude, it was a pleasure. I enjoyed it. And hopefully my workflow is applicable to other people. People can look at it and see that, like, hey, using AI, it's just not that hard. You just got to talk to the computer and it'll do stuff for you.